Have you ever noticed how some forms of disrespect are so subtle that you don't but actually immediately? You feel something is wrong. You feel your energy drop. You replay the conversation later in your mind and suddenly realize what happened. The problem is that by the time you recognize it, the moment has passed, the boundary was crossed, and the other person has learned something dangerous about you. They have learned what you will tolerate. Human beings are constantly teaching other people how to treat them. Not with speeches, not with demands, not with motivational quotes. We teach people through what we allow. Every interaction becomes training. Every time someone crosses a line and experiences no consequence, they receive information. They learn that the line wasn't real. The first type of disrespect you should never tolerate is repeated interruption. Everyone interrupts occasionally. Conversations are messy. Excitement causes people to jump in. That's normal. What we're talking about is different. We're talking about the person who repeatedly cuts you off whenever you speak. The person who treats your thoughts as less important than their own. The person who seems unable to wait 5 seconds for you to finish a sentence. What makes this behavior powerful is that it often appears small. It doesn't feel serious enough to confront. That's why it works. Imagine you're speaking in a group. You start explaining an idea. Halfway through your sentence, someone jumps in. You stop talking. A few minutes later, you try again. The same thing happens. By the end of the conversation, you've contributed almost nothing. Now ask yourself a question. What message was communicated? The obvious message is that you didn't get to finish speaking. The deeper message is that your contribution was considered less valuable. People reveal their internal hierarchy through behavior. When someone constantly interrupts, they are communicating where they believe you belong within that hierarchy. The mistake many people make is assuming that tolerance creates respect. They think being patient will eventually earn consideration. In reality, repeated tolerance without correction often produces the opposite effect. The most powerful response is not emotional. It's calm. When interrupted, simply continue after they finish. Let me complete that thought. Notice what happens. Confident people don't ask permission to finish speaking. They assume they have the right to complete their sentence. The second type of disrespect you should never tolerate is public humiliation disguised as humor. This one is extremely common because it hides behind laughter. Someone makes a joke at your expense. Everyone laughs. You feel uncomfortable. Then something interesting happens. The person immediately says, "Relax. I'm just kidding." Think carefully about what just happened. A statement was made. You reacted. Then your reaction was framed as the problem. Now you're in a psychological trap. If you object, you're sensitive. If you stay silent, the behavior continues. This tactic works because people are often more afraid of appearing emotional than being disrespected. Humor is powerful. Healthy humor builds connection. But humiliation disguised as humor serves a different purpose. It lowers one person while elevating another. Watch group dynamics carefully. You'll notice that some individuals repeatedly target the same person. Why? Because they're testing status. They're checking whether resistance exists. Every group has invisible rules. When nobody challenges disrespectful humor, the behavior becomes normalized. You don't need anger. You don't need confrontation. Sometimes a simple question is enough. What did you mean by that? Something remarkable happens when you ask for clarification. Many disrespectful comments survive only because they move quickly. When forced into the light, they become uncomfortable. The speaker suddenly has to explain the joke. Now the group sees the behavior clearly. Calm exposure is often more powerful than emotional reaction. The third type of disrespect you should never tolerate is consistent disregard for your time. Time is the one resource every person possesses in equal amounts. Money can be replaced. Opportunities can return. Time moves in one direction. That's why chronic disrespect for your time is never really about scheduling. It's about value. Consider the person who is always late. Not occasionally. Always. The person who expects flexibility from everyone else, while offering none themselves. The person who cancels at the last minute repeatedly. The person who keeps you waiting without explanation. Many people excuse this behavior because they don't want conflict. But patterns matter. Anybody can have an emergency. Anybody can face unexpected circumstances. Patterns reveal priorities. When someone repeatedly wastes your time, they are communicating something. They are saying their convenience matters more than your commitment. Now here's where people get confused. They think protecting their time requires aggression. It doesn't. It requires consistency. If someone repeatedly arrives late, stop restructuring your life around their habits. If meetings start at a certain time, start at that time. If opportunities have deadlines, maintain those deadlines. Boundaries are not speeches. Boundaries are actions. The strongest boundary in the world is predictable consequence. People respect what remains consistent. The fourth type of disrespect you should never tolerate is being treated as an emotional dumping ground. Many caring people struggle with this. They have empathy. They listen. They support others. These are strengths. But strengths become vulnerabilities when boundaries disappear. Have you ever known someone who only contacts you when they need something? Notice the pattern. Weeks of silence. Then suddenly a crisis. Hours of complaints. Hours of negativity. Hours of emotional unloading. Then they disappear again. Relationships require reciprocity. Not perfection. Not equal accounting. Reciprocity. Healthy relationships involve exchange. Support flows both directions. Interest flows both directions. Effort flows both directions. When one person constantly takes and never gives, something unhealthy develops. The difficult part is that helpers often confuse exhaustion with compassion. They believe being available at all times proves loyalty. In reality, unlimited access often creates dependency rather than respect. Pay attention to how you feel after interactions. Do you feel energized, respected, valued, or do you feel drained every single time? Your emotional state contains information. People often ignore that information because they don't want to appear selfish. But protecting your mental space is not selfish. It's responsible. If someone repeatedly unloads negativity onto you without concern for your well-being, you are not witnessing friendship. You are witnessing extraction. The fifth type of disrespect you should never tolerate is persistent dismissal of your boundaries. This is the most important one because it includes all the others. A boundary is simply a statement about what is acceptable and what is not. That's it. Nothing dramatic. Nothing complicated. Yet boundaries reveal more about a relationship than almost anything else. Why? Because they expose how people react when they don't get what they want. Anyone can be pleasant when circumstances favor them. Character appears when limits are introduced. Imagine telling someone you are unavailable. A respectful person accepts the information. A disrespectful person treats the boundary as the beginning of a negotiation. They push, question, pressure, challenge, guilt, manipulate. They behave as if your decision exists solely to be changed. Watch carefully. The reaction matters more than the request. Some people hear no and immediately become offended. That response tells you something valuable. It tells you they benefited from your lack of boundaries in the past. People who respect you do not require unlimited access to you. They don't require constant agreement. They don't require immediate compliance. One of the most revealing moments in any relationship occurs when you calmly refuse something. You learn very quickly whether the person values you or merely values what they can obtain from you. Here's a principle worth remembering. Every act of disrespect begins as a test. Not always consciously, not always maliciously, but a test nonetheless. Human beings constantly explore limits. Children do it. Co-workers do it. Friends do it. Family members do it. Strangers do it. The question is never whether tests will occur. The question is how you respond. When a line is crossed and nothing happens, the line moves. When the line moves, expectations change. When expectations change, treatment changes. Eventually, people begin interacting with the version of you that you'd accidentally trained them to expect. That's why confidence is often misunderstood. Many people think confidence is loud. They think confidence is dominance. They think confidence is intimidation. Real confidence is much quieter. Real confidence is the ability to remain calm while enforcing standards. Anyone can explode. Anyone can lose control. Anyone can react emotionally. Not everyone can remain composed while protecting their self-respect. The strongest individuals are often the least dramatic. They don't chase validation. They don't demand respect. They don't beg for better treatment. They simply refuse to participate in dynamics that violate their standards. Notice the difference. Demanding respect focuses on controlling others. Maintaining standards focuses on controlling yourself. One is fragile. The other is powerful. People often ask why disrespect seems to increase over time. The answer is surprisingly simple. Behavior that works tends to continue. Behavior that fails tends to disappear. This principle governs human interaction everywhere. If guilt works, guilt continues. If manipulation works, manipulation continues. If interruption works, interruption continues. If disrespect works, disrespect continues. The moment it stops working, the incentive changes. That doesn't mean every difficult person transforms overnight. Some won't. Some will become frustrated. Some will leave. And that's important. Because not every relationship is meant to survive healthy boundaries. Sometimes boundaries don't destroy relationships. They reveal relationships that were already unhealthy. When someone only values you under conditions of unlimited access, unlimited tolerance, and unlimited sacrifice, what they value is not you. They value the arrangement. The arrangement benefits them. The moment the arrangement changes, their attitude changes. That's not a friendship problem. That's a clarity moment. One of the most useful questions you can ask yourself is this: what behavior am I repeatedly rewarding? Most people focus on what bothers them. Very few focus on what they reinforce. Every interaction creates reinforcement. Attention reinforces. Accommodation reinforces. Silence reinforces. Compliance reinforces. When you understand reinforcement, human behavior becomes easier to predict. People move toward outcomes that benefit them, which means your response shapes future treatment more than your intentions ever will. You may intend to be kind. You may intend to be understanding. You may intend to avoid conflict. But if the outcome teaches others they can ignore your limits, the lesson remains the same. Respect begins internally before it appears externally. People often search for techniques, special phrases, perfect responses, magic words. Those things matter less than most people think. What matters is conviction. A boundary delivered with uncertainty invites challenge. A boundary delivered with calm certainty communicates finality. You don't need a long explanation. You don't need a courtroom defense. You don't need unanimous approval. You simply need alignment between what you believe and what you tolerate. The moment those two become consistent, something changes. You stop negotiating against yourself. You stop explaining obvious standards. You stop feeling guilty for protecting your time, energy, attention, and dignity. And perhaps most importantly, you begin attracting people who already operate with those standards themselves. Because respectful people rarely fear boundaries. They appreciate them. Respectful people understand limits. They understand reciprocity. They understand consideration. They understand mutual value. The individuals who react negatively to healthy boundaries often reveal exactly why those boundaries were needed in the first place. Most people never realize that disrespect rarely arrives wearing a warning label. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't walk into your life and say, "I'm here to lower your confidence, drain your energy, and slowly redefine what you'll accept." Instead, it arrives in small moments. A comment, a look, a dismissal, a broken promise, a pattern that seems too insignificant to address. That's why it becomes dangerous. Human beings adapt to almost anything. Give a person enough exposure to a behavior, and eventually it starts to feel normal. The extraordinary becomes ordinary. The unacceptable becomes expected. The line that once felt obvious becomes blurry. This is how standards disappear. Not all at once. One compromise at a time. Think about a person who constantly minimizes your accomplishments. You tell them about a success. Instead of celebrating, they immediately shift attention elsewhere. Instead of encouragement, you receive criticism. Instead of support, you receive comparison. At first, it seems harmless. Maybe they're having a bad day. Maybe they're distracted. Maybe they didn't understand. But after the 10th time, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Some people cannot tolerate seeing others grow. Not because they're evil, not because they're consciously trying to sabotage you, but because your progress forces them to confront their own lack of movement. And that's uncomfortable. Human beings often protect themselves from discomfort by diminishing the source of it. If your success highlights their inactivity, one solution is to improve themselves. Another solution is to reduce the significance of your success. Guess which option requires less effort? This is why some people respond to achievement with indifference. Not because achievement lacks value, but because acknowledging it creates psychological tension. You must be careful not to confuse familiarity with loyalty. Many people stay connected to individuals who repeatedly undermine them simply because they've known them for a long time. Time invested does not automatically create value. A toxic pattern repeated for 10 years is still a toxic pattern. Length of relationship does not determine quality of relationship. Watch how people respond when good things happen to you. The reaction reveals more than words ever could. Genuine support has a different energy. There is no hesitation, no forced enthusiasm, no hidden competition. People who genuinely care about you don't experience your victories as their losses. They experience your victories as evidence that positive things are possible. Another form of disrespect that should never be tolerated is deliberate inconsistency. This is a behavior that creates confusion. One day someone treats you with warmth. The next day they become cold. One day they're supportive. The next day they're distant. One day you're important. The next day you're ignored. Now, everyone has mood changes. Everyone experiences stress. That's not what we're discussing. We're discussing a pattern of unpredictability that keeps you emotionally off balance. Why does this matter? Because confusion creates dependency. When people don't know where they stand, they often invest more energy trying to figure it out. Think about a slot machine. Nobody becomes addicted because rewards are guaranteed. The addiction develops because rewards are unpredictable. Sometimes you win. Sometimes you lose. The uncertainty keeps people engaged. The same principle can appear in relationships. When attention becomes inconsistent, many individuals start working harder for approval. They chase clarity. They chase reassurance. They chase certainty. Meanwhile, the other person controls the emotional climate. The healthiest relationships don't require constant interpretation. You shouldn't need detective skills to determine whether someone values you. Respect creates clarity. Disrespect creates confusion. Pay attention whenever you find yourself constantly analyzing someone's behavior. If every interaction feels like a puzzle, something important may be happening. Strong relationships are not built on guessing games. They're built on consistency. Another behavior that deserves immediate attention is chronic dismissal of your concerns. You communicate a problem. The person ignores it. You express discomfort. The person minimizes it. You explain your perspective. The person mocks it. This behavior is particularly destructive because it attacks your perception of reality. Over time, people begin questioning themselves. Maybe I'm overreacting. Maybe I'm being difficult. Maybe it's not a big deal. The problem is that repeated dismissal trains you to distrust your own judgment. Once that happens, boundaries become difficult to maintain. Because boundaries depend on confidence in your perception. You must believe your experiences matter. You must believe your observations have value. You must believe your emotions contain useful information. Not perfect information. Not infallible information. Useful information. A person who respects you doesn't have to agree with every concern you raise. Agreement is not required. Respect is. There is a significant difference. Respect says, I understand that this matters to you. Disrespect says, what matters to you doesn't matter. One creates connection. The other creates distance. Another type of disrespect appears through constant one-upmanship. You share a story. They have a bigger story. You share a challenge. They faced a harder challenge. You share an accomplishment. They accomplished more. Every conversation becomes a competition. Every interaction becomes a status contest. The strange thing is that many people engage in this behavior without realizing it. They're so focused on proving value that they never learn how to create connection. Connection requires curiosity. Competition requires comparison. You cannot deeply listen while simultaneously preparing evidence that you more impressive. And that's exactly what happens. The conversation stops being about understanding. It becomes about ranking. The individual who constantly needs to establish superiority communicates something unintentionally. They're insecure. Secure people rarely need to remind others of their importance. Their behavior communicates it naturally. The strongest person in the room often speaks the least about their strength. The smartest person in the room rarely spends all their time proving intelligence. The most confident person in the room rarely demands recognition. Neediness often disguises itself as superiority. When someone constantly competes with you, they're not demonstrating confidence. They're demonstrating dependence on external validation. You should never tolerate relationships where your role is to serve as an audience rather than a participant. Mutual respect requires mutual space. Both people matter. Both perspectives matter. Both experiences matter. Another dangerous form of disrespect is repeated broken commitments. Trust is built through consistency, not intention, not promises, not potential. Consistency. Anyone can make a promise. Making a promise requires words. Keeping a promise requires character. There's a difference. Many people become attached to who someone says they are rather than who they consistently prove themselves to be. That's where disappointment begins. Human beings naturally want to believe the best. We want to believe promises. We want to believe intentions. We want to believe future improvements are coming. Sometimes they are. Often, they aren't. Behavior predicts future behavior better than promises do. If someone repeatedly fails to honor commitments, stop evaluating them based on what they say will happen. Evaluate them based on what repeatedly happens. This shift changes everything. You stop living inside potential. You start living inside reality. Reality is where decisions become easier. Potential creates endless excuses. Reality creates clarity. One of the most expensive mistakes people make is staying loyal to future versions of others that may never exist. They become emotionally attached to possibilities. Years pass. Nothing changes. The pattern remains. The disappointment grows. Respect yourself enough to evaluate patterns honestly. Patterns reveal priorities. Patterns reveal character. Patterns reveal truth. Words are easy. Patterns are difficult to fake. Another subtle form of disrespect occurs when people repeatedly violate privacy. They share information you trusted them with. They expose personal details for entertainment. They use vulnerability as social currency. Trust should never become a weapon. When someone demonstrates carelessness with confidential information, they're communicating something critical. They value attention more than trust. That's not a small issue. Trust takes enormous effort to build. One careless action can damage it permanently. Notice how trustworthy people behave. They don't collect secrets. They protect them. They don't broadcast vulnerabilities. They respect them. They understand that access to personal information is a privilege, not a resource to be exploited. Respect grows where trust exists. Trust grows where discretion exists. Without discretion, neither survives. Another behavior you should examine carefully is selective respect. This is fascinating because it exposes true character quickly. Some people treat powerful individuals with exceptional courtesy. They treat supervisors respectfully, influential people respectfully, successful people respectfully. Then they treat everyone else poorly. What does that tell you? It tells you the behavior isn't respect. It's strategy. Real respect is consistent. Strategic respect is conditional. One comes from values. The other comes from self-interest. Watch how people treat individuals who can do nothing for them. Watch how they treat service workers. Watch how they treat strangers. Watch how they treat people with less influence. Those moments reveal far more than polished public behavior ever will. Character becomes visible when incentives disappear. When there's nothing to gain, authenticity emerges. A person who respects only upward doesn't respect people. They respect advantages. There's a major difference. And understanding that difference can save you years of frustration. Because eventually, circumstances change. Positions change. Influence changes. Status changes. And if someone's respect depends entirely on what you can provide, their treatment will change the moment your usefulness changes. True respect survives changing circumstances. Conditional respect survives only favorable circumstances. One is stable, the other is temporary. Never confuse the two. One of the most overlooked truths about self-respect is that it grows through action, not thought. People often wait until they feel confident before establishing boundaries, but confidence frequently arrives afterward, not before. Every time you protect a boundary, your self-respect strengthens. Every time you honor your values, your confidence increases. Every time you stop tolerating behavior that violates your standards, you send a message to yourself. The message is simple. My needs matter. My time matters. My dignity matters. My voice matters. And that internal message changes everything. Because eventually, the way you see yourself influences the way others see you. Not through magic, not through manifestation, through behavior. Your standards become visible. Your expectations become clear. Your responses become predictable. And people adapt accordingly. The world constantly studies what you'll accept. Every interaction contributes data. Every response teaches something. Every boundary communicates information. The question isn't whether people will test limits. The question is whether your actions will reinforce the standards you claim to have. Because the most powerful boundary is not spoken. It's demonstrated. And once people understand that your standards are real, not theoretical, the entire dynamic changes. Some individuals will rise to meet those standards. Some will disappear. Both outcomes are useful, because every person who leaves when healthy boundaries appear was benefiting from their absence.